We had good coverage across both genders, across different age groups, obviously slight differences between the sample and the target population, as is natural with any sample, but we've tried to control for these differences through relating, etc. Again, just to confirm, good spread across different states and territories. Let me just dive into the meat. So in terms of residential and migration histories, this is largely consistent with census patterns. So about 84% is what we estimate currently living in a large city, defined as a city with a population of greater than 100,000 residents. And then 16.5% living in a mid-sized city, so anything smaller than 100,000. This is a busy table, but let me just sort of break it down a little bit. So the rows represent the cause for why a person moved from one city to the other. And then the columns are showing how these reasons tend to vary depending on whether you're moving from a small to a large city or a large to a small city, and also as a function of your past migration history. So just the first column, or the second column here, is just showing across the sample, which are the most likely important issues that trigger a move. Unsurprisingly, employment is the most common trigger, followed by proximity to family, or you just have never left, so you're living still in the place that you were born in, or you've returned to it later in life. Going down the list, then quality of life becomes important. Education in particular is quite interesting because it tends to stand out as this particular reason for why people have left small cities and gone to large cities, right? So 18.5% of people who move from a small to a large city did so for education, etc. But in general, just the headline, high-level important triggers: employment, social ties, quality of life, and education, right? So just sort of keep this in mind as I go through the slides. Then in terms of attitudes and perceptions of both small and large cities, so this is basically what we did was we showed them a bunch of different attributes, and we asked each respondent to rate or to state whether they agree or disagree with characterizing either a small city as, for instance, a great place to work, and a large city as a great place to work, etc. So basically the bars are just showing the percentage of respondents that agreed that a particular characteristic was a good descriptor of either a small city or a large city. And what's interesting, perhaps unsurprising, is that mid-sized cities tend to be rated much better in terms of quality of life factors, right? So family friendly, safety, easy to get around, easy access to nature, great sense of community, etc. Whereas large cities tend to do well more in terms of urban amenities, particularly if you're looking at cultural amenities, so good nightlife, shopping options, dining options, and not as badly on other things like employment, education, etc. And then, like I mentioned, the centerpiece was a state of preference experiment. So what we did was each respondent was presented 8 scenarios, and these scenarios, each scenario presented them a choice of living in 2 different cities that vary in terms of the attributes shown here. So just high-level macroeconomic variables, along with climate and distance to coast. And then for reference, given that I live in Adelaide, so in this case, I'm being shown Adelaide's characteristics, but depending on where the respondent lived in, we also showed the analogous characteristics of their current place of residence, just so they had a baseline for comparison in case they don't quite know how to interpret some of these variables. We also did have a glossary where we showed them other examples of what, for instance, a mixed function city might be, etc., etc. These attributes were varied systematically based on an experiment design. So this is just showing the range of values that different attributes could take. As I said, they were varied systematically, basically just to make sure that we had appropriate coverage across a wide range of variables, and that the trade-offs that respondents were being asked to make made sense from a behavioral standpoint. All right, so just going to try and summarize the findings using this table. I'm going to break it down. Basically, without looking into the details just now, I'll talk you through them. At a high level, our analysis identified 4 segments in the population that vary in terms of their willingness to live in either a small city or a large metropolitan center. We've ordered these segments in terms of increasing willingness to live in a smaller town or decreasing willingness to live in a large city. So you have at the left, it's about 16% of the population who pretty much would be, it would take a lot, I should say, to get them to move to a smaller town. They are very happy living in a large city. They are likely to have always lived in large cities and, as I said, reluctant to leave. At the other end of the spectrum, about 9% of the population, similarly stubborn in their views, but differently so in that they would rather live in a smaller town than a large city. They are currently living in a smaller town or have lived one in the past. And it would, again, take a lot for them to get them to move to a larger city. In terms of the demographics, as you'd expect, people who really like large cities tend to be younger, higher income professionals that tend to be in the early stages of their life cycle, so more likely to be single or partnered, but not have children. Whereas the other end of the spectrum, it sort of, again, correlates with life cycle, so they're much further along in the life cycle, they're more likely to be older, either partially employed or completely retired. They're also more likely to be lower income individuals and lower levels of education. But basically together, they comprise a quarter of the population. These are the people that you are not going to be able to persuade to change their opinion. But then in the middle, you have the remaining 3/4, and these are sort of the people that are more amenable to potentially moving. And so the class 2 is about 20%. These people or these individuals really care about unemployment rates more so than any of the other attributes. And if you start digging in deeper, so they tend to be early to middle life cycle, so a mix of young individuals as well as middle-aged individuals with children, tend to be, again, highly educated, employed full-time, high-wage, white-collar jobs, managerial or professional jobs, etc. And they really care about unemployment. They actually don't view large cities as good places to live, would happily move to smaller cities if offered support for home ownership, etc. But the reasons most likely for living in a large city tend to do with employment. They just cannot find the employment opportunities that would convince them to move to a smaller town. The other class, which is about half of the population, they are more what an economist would call a rational utility maximizer, in that they are sensitive to all sorts of macroeconomic attributes of a city. These people are slightly further along in the life cycle compared to class 2, so more likely to be middle-aged or older. These people are also closer to retirement, and slightly different from class 2. They view mid-sized cities as good places to retire and would move there if they could get support for post-retirement living. And so if I can just sort of summarize the 3 key findings, basically there's, as you'd expect, a strong correlation of life cycles. So as I mentioned, young people often move to a larger city due to education opportunities. Middle-aged adults are most likely either stuck where they are or have moved to where they are currently in search of employment opportunities. Older adults who are nearing retirement or have already retired. They're no longer tethered in some ways to employment. And so they're freer in some sense to live wherever they want. That's also why we see a greater proportion living in regional areas. And these people would, in general, be persuaded to move there if they could get better support for post-retirement living. And so all of this can then sort of be translated into 4 high-level policy options. Some of these are old policies that we've been trying for many decades now without significant success. The first 2 in particular, so developing both employment and education opportunities in regional centres. We've been trying to do this, as I said, we've had limited success. There's a lot of studies in the regional economics literature that have argued that governments tend to have limited capacity to force economic outcomes, and that a lot of the outmigration that we've seen, not just in Australia, but elsewhere from regional areas, is just an inevitable outcome of structural shifts in economic activity. Number 3 and number 4 perhaps are newer opportunities for encouraging greater population decentralization. Number 3 in particular, as a result of the pandemic, you see more remote working happening. This seminar being one example of how remote working's changed the importance of physical proximity. Most evidence to date indicates that increased adoption of remote working is more likely to lead to greater suburbanization than it is necessarily to outmigration to regional areas. But some of that will depend on the nature of these remote working arrangements. If we're stuck with hybrid arrangements, we're still tethered to the workplace. We're commuting less, but we're still commuting, even if it's only 2 or 3 days a week. But if more and more people adopt fully remote working arrangements, then you're completely liberated from that workplace location, and that could potentially encourage greater regional living. And so there's an opportunity in there for government to either incentivize remote working uptake and or support it through appropriate investment in digital infrastructure. The final one is a policy that's gained more currency in the last decade or so, which is really to look at these regional centres as places that can offer tree change or sea change in the parlance of popular media, basically places that can afford or that can offer a higher quality of life to people who do not require access to employment of the kind that can only be offered in larger cities. And so really continuing investment in developing that kind of post-retirement infrastructure could create a whole new service-based economy in regional centres that then offers employment opportunities for younger adults in and around supporting services for post-retirement living. So I'll stop there. That's the key summary of findings from this work. I'm going to hand it over to Laura now, and she's going to talk us through the work that she did.
Thanks very much, Vish. I think we've got a bit of time. If there's a few questions, we could take 2 or 3 questions for Vish before we move to Laura. Please put your e-hand or your real hand up. Or pop your question in the chat. Well, I have one. So I was thinking as you were talking and presenting about the importance of high-speed rail and transport connections, and I was wondering whether the shift to regional areas you think might encourage some more activity in that space.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, high-speed rail, I think, will potentially have a similar effect to what I said for remote working, in that it would potentially expand the suburban boundary out further. And so again, this places that are most likely to profit would be places, for instance, like Wollongong or Newcastle, that are in close proximity already to a large metropolitan centre. And we're seeing that happening, right? Like the coast is becoming increasingly one single urban consolidated centre over time. So I think high-speed rail will strengthen those patterns. Whether it will create opportunities for new settlement in other parts of the interior that aren't necessarily in close proximity, I'm less doubtful about. And if people are only commuting, so in effect, if these regional centres are just bedroom communities, the benefits to these communities is not quite the same as it would be if they were actually the centres of economic activity themselves. So, I mean, it's an opportunity, but I think it's demerits. I mean, it's sort of it's a second best, in my opinion, because it's really just relocating residents there without necessarily generating strong economic activity.
I guess I was thinking with the move of a lot of workplaces to part-time in person and part-time at home, there might be some, people might be willing to take a longer train ride 2 or 3 days a week, whereas they wouldn't 5 days a week.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And even without high-speed rail, I mean, if you're commuting 2 or 3 days a week, that's potentially 40 to 60% reduction in the time you spend. And there's this whole idea of a weekly travel time budget that humans inherently have, where we're happy to spend, about an hour a day, roughly on average for the last 200 years commuting. And so as technologies have gotten quicker and faster, that's allowed us to live further away. And so, yeah, both high-speed rail and remote working, I think, will just continue that pattern of increasing what's possible in terms of the suburban boundary. Yeah.
Great. We have a question from Christopher.
Hi, Akshay. Great presentation. As someone who's not from Australia, I recently came here this year. I'm trying to get used to what the general policy situation and approaches with the government with regards to issues like these. Because I'm getting mixed messages, because if there's definitely this element of recently there's been a huge shift to the regions, and from what I gathered from your presentation, it's taking the position of, okay, how do we keep the people who shifted to the regions there or continue that trend? But then I'm also hearing a lot of discussion about, oh, but the centers of the cities are empty. We need to bring people back in. So I guess I'm curious what the balance of power is between getting the people, pulling people away from the capital cities and more into the regions versus the capital cities who still want to bring people back into their centers. And so that does seem to be a push and pull there. And I'm curious, is it pretty much split? And like, is there different positions in the federal government versus the state governments on what that balance of power is? Is that a touchy subject area? I'm just curious how things fit with regards to that. And yeah, if you could speak to that.
I mean, I might not be the best person to answer this question, because I'm more an econometrician who's only about 2 years into this area, but I'll give you my sense of what I've gathered based on my interactions with different levels of government across. I mean, there's definitely a huge tension between these issues. I think there's been a chronic complaint about how Sydney and Melbourne tend to dominate the discussion around future population growth and where and how investments in infrastructure ought to be prioritized, etc. So there's definitely that. The regions come and go depending on the political cycle. Their importance tends to fluctuate. Given the ongoing debate, I think it's a complicated one. I think there's too many variables at play here. As you said, the cities losing their value as centers. There's big cities that are losing, like Melbourne and Sydney. And then there's potentially regional centers like Newcastle and Wollongong, and in and around Melbourne as well, Geelong, etc., that have profited. But there's also a third dynamic that's at play around mid-sized cities like Adelaide and Perth that have grown substantially during the pandemic. And so I think there's just a lot of movement going on, and I'm not sure exactly where we'll settle on that.
Awesome. Okay, thank you for enlightening me. Thank you.
We have a question from Leo Patterson-Ross in the chat, which I'll read out, Mitch, and we'll make this one the last one before Laura gives her presentation. Leo asks whether there was a shift in tenure types as people move from metro to regional areas or vice versa. He says the assumption might be that owner occupation is more viable in regional areas, but if people aren't sure of the permanency of the change, they might continue to rent, which would limit their ability to become embedded in the new communities.
Yeah, I mean, while we didn't look at strictly how tenure types changed. In that move, what we did find was that home ownership was definitely a very strong motivator for why people would want to move to a regional area. So the idea that you can get affordable housing against, say, the pressures that you're facing in a highly congested market like Sydney or Melbourne. So that was definitely a very strong motivator in the top 5 or 6 reasons for why people have moved.
Great, thanks. We'll hand over to Laura for the second part of the presentation.
Thanks, Hazel, and thanks, Vish. Let's see if I can get my slides up here. There we go. Can you see that okay?
Yes.
Okay, so as Vish said, this is another of the 3 projects that are part of the broader inquiry looking at issues around migration to and changes happening in regional Australia. I had a great team supporting me doing this research. It certainly wasn't a solo effort across 4 different universities, and that allowed us to get out into regional areas and actually sort of do the fieldwork for this project on the ground, which was great. This was the focus of this project was really to bring some qualitative research to the broader inquiry, and I guess to have an opportunity to visit regional areas to do a bit of ground truthing of some of the observations that were coming out of the statistical and census analysis that was going on in the other projects, and to really ask some quite broad questions, but trying to capture, I guess, the diversity of what's happening in regional Australia through those questions. So looking at the role of experience, lived experience, place-based experience in the lives of residents in regional cities, and trying to dig in a little bit to understand some of these trade-offs and negotiations that people go through that Vish was talking about, between looking at housing opportunities, employment opportunities, and quality of life in regional areas. We did this research through the back half of 2020 and the start of 2021, which was a very interesting time to be visiting regional Australia, but also a challenging time. And I guess reflecting what was going on in Australia and regional areas during that period, we also had 2 additional questions that came out of the research, looking at responses from local residents to this growing narrative about we need to grow regional Australia. The shift to regional Australia is happening. This is a solution for our population pressures in our major cities. And then also picking up increasingly on the impact that COVID-19 was having on people in regional areas. I won't touch too much on the second one in this presentation, but I can reflect on it further in the questions if people are interested. So what we did was focus groups across 5 cities with a relatively small group of residents. Unfortunately, the realities of COVID and travel and being in group environments made that a little bit tricky, and also interviews with a range of stakeholders in each place, so local government, key employers, other service providers, folks from universities, anchor institutions like that. The cities we looked at were Cairns, Wollongong, Albury-Wodonga, Mildura and Whyalla. And the aim in choosing those cities was really to try to get as diverse a range of regional places as we could, a range of sizes and different economic drivers that were shaping what was happening in those places, some that were growing very rapidly, one that was not growing or in fact sort of really going backwards in terms of population in Whyalla. So we could start to sort of, I guess, dig into the complexities and diversities rather than and I guess that was a bit of a response to the sense that there is often a tendency to talk about regional Australia, and we've done it in this, in framing this set of presentations, but trying to pick up on the fact that there is this huge amount of diversity going on in these places. So what did people tell us? We asked them, picking up on the kinds of themes that Vish was looking at, what would attract them or what did attract them to living in regional areas. And the sorts of things that came through were very similar and I guess reflected past research in this area. So quicker commuting gives you more free time to spend on things you like to do with your family or on leisure activities. The attraction of housing definitely came through that we were just talking about, and both the idea that the sense it was more affordable but also more spacious. You could, you might be able to afford an apartment in a city, but you could access a standalone house in a regional area. And then people talked quite a lot about the sort of the social aspect of regional living, that sense of community and belonging that they felt in their city, and the appeal of being able to access natural environments more easily and more quickly. And I guess stepping back and reflecting on this, it was really clear that this sort of amenity aspect was a bit of what we labelled the it factor. So people have to do these complicated calculations to try and work out whether regional living makes sense for them. But often it's the desire for that sort of additional quality of life that they see regional cities representing that prompts them to go through the process of trying to say, can we make the housing work? Can we make the jobs work? Can we find the education opportunities that we need for our children? Those sorts of things. Just one quote from a participant. This was a participant who had moved to Cairns and I think really summed up this kind of desire for a different quality of life and experience from regional living. So said, looking at all the other people in the same industry sector as I was in, there was no quality of life. I watched people having to strive to make huge incomes and not be able to afford their lifestyle. I watched people do it and I saw them all fail and be miserable. So my husband's family was from up here, and we decided to see if we could be closer, and it was lifestyle. I did not want to be working in the big city, commuting an hour and raising children. On the flip side, there were certainly disadvantages that participants raised about living in regional areas, particularly strong there. Again, I think aligning with the findings from Vish's project, where there was reduced career opportunities, and particularly that really kicked in as people's career progressed. So they might find a good job to begin with, but then finding that next opportunity or the subsequent one was not so easy. Essential services was a really common theme. Health, number one, education, number two, and concern about access to those, particularly access to specialists, and also access to GPs in the health space. And there was a lot of concern amongst participants about what they perceived as a decline in housing affordability, and interestingly, quite common references to particular difficulty for people looking for rental properties, and a perceived real lack of social and affordable housing. And then lastly, there was a sense that one of the things you do give up by moving to a regional area is access to the same depth and breadth of cultural activities and sporting activities and sporting events that you might have in a big centre. Again, just one quote that I think really taps into this concern about the opportunities for a long, fruitful career in regional areas. This was from a participant in Wollongong, sort of saying that, I'm using a poor metaphor here, but if you're going up a tree in the city, there's a whole heap of branches, whereas here it's like, well, there's the trunk of the tree and there's not a whole heap outside of that. You can follow this line, but there aren't that many employers. So there were jobs and there was work that could be done and that was suitable, but it didn't have the breadth and the sort of the range of opportunities that were on offer in bigger cities. Turning then to this question around growth, and I think this is a particularly interesting set of discussions in the context of what's happening, both the sense that there has been this big shift in interest of people moving from capital cities to regional areas, but also a very clear policy message that's been growing over the past 5 years or so about looking to regional areas as an opportunity to take some of the pressure, the population pressure off our big cities. And so this was something that participants were very alert to, and I think had really nuanced perspectives. And generally speaking, there was concern about the prospect of growth, but it wasn't about growth across the board. It was about growth that was done in a way that was seen as unsustainable or too rapid. So people said, you know, we're open to the idea of growth if it doesn't diminish our lifestyle benefits and it doesn't put more service or more strain on the services that we're already struggling to access. And similarly, if it's managed in a way that doesn't create additional environmental impacts. And that was particularly a concern in places like Cairns, where you do have a very vulnerable and important environmental context that the city sits in. Not surprisingly, places that weren't growing, Whyalla in particular was quite enthusiastic for growth because they could see that there was a real risk of starting to impact availability of services and things like that if the population continued to decline. I think these two quotes capture that sort of that nuance and that sense of what sort of growth people in regional areas are open to. So saying, you know, development per se is not a bad thing. It's poor development that's a bad thing, no matter how small scale it is. Good development can be a good thing on a larger scale, but it has to be planned and thought about and prepared. It can't be done ad hoc off the back of an envelope. And sometimes I think that's how it's been done. Or similarly, sort of saying, you know, what they're trying to do is grow the population first and then wonder about how to adapt. Whereas if they'd actually build the facilities and infrastructure, but they'd rather invite people to come in and fight over the scraps. And I think there's a horse and cart scenario. If they want to do it, they can do it properly by investing money and accepting that there won't be an immediate return, but it will take time. The other, I guess, theme that came through in different ways in all of the cities that we looked at was that there's this real need for, I guess, planning that does reflect the diverse nature of these different cities and the contexts that they're operating within. So there were some shared themes, but then there were lots of things that were quite distinctive. In particular, not surprisingly, given the period of lockdowns that we'd been through and the impact that had on towns that sit on borders like Albury, Wodonga and Mildura, there was a theme that I think well and truly predated COVID, but a real focus on the complexities that creates for people trying to do things in two states with two regulatory frameworks and, you know, different governments shaping how things work in those places. The really central role that some of these cities play as hubs for broader regions and the support role of that was very clear, and particularly that's the case for Cairns and Mildura. And so that had a real impact on how people thought about what services they needed to have in the city and how much demand there was going to be for that. It was a much bigger picture thing than simply looking at who lives in the city itself. In places where there had previously been major kind of industrial players, major companies that had shaped the sort of the industrial employment history of those places, there was a real sense that since those industries had declined, they may have been replaced or managed in terms of the employment, but the loss of the kind of broader support structures that companies played in terms of helping new migrants to settle in, introducing people to the ways that things worked in these places, making connections between people, that was seen as something that was lacking now and that hadn't been picked up by government as well in the aftermath of those companies sort of stepping away from that role. And then particular challenges that places like Wollongong are going through, given their function as both an independent regional city, but also increasingly a sort of a satellite city or a commuter hub for the bigger city in Sydney. And so seeing a lot of growth that's driven by people who aren't actually working in the city and trying to work out how to manage that disconnect between population growth, but not necessarily employment growth to match. So just some final thoughts, I guess, to wrap up. I guess, as I said, it's this interesting combination where we see lots.
Laura, your sound has just stopped.
Oh. Am I back?
Yep, you're back.
I'm back. Great. Small pause for you to all collect your thoughts. So yes, as I said, an interesting mix between, on one hand, lots of diversity in the particular challenges that these places are facing, and the need to focus on that through processes of place-based planning and local planning that really understands those contexts. But then I guess we do see these broader themes, particularly in similar responses around concerns to growth. Interestingly, again, everywhere we went, people said that, you know, the sense of the town feel, the village feel, the closeness of the community was a big part of what attracted them to that area, even though you're looking at places from sort of 30,000 up to about 300,000. So there is, I think, an opportunity to sort of, you know, shape the way that different sized regional centres grow and do that in a way that maintains those elements, even though, you know, some regional cities are obviously much larger and operating at quite a different scale to others. I think probably the key takeaway from this, from our point of view, was the reinforcement of this message that it's so important that people in regional areas feel that regional growth planning is designed to benefit them and not something that's happening to them in order to benefit the big cities. And that taps into a long history of sort of perception that planning, strategic planning, happens from the capital cities, and either you know, regions are dictated to, or you know, or sometimes forgotten, but not included in the sort of the process in the way that they would like to be. So I think, you know, as this conversation about regional Australia continues in the sort of the policy debate, this tendency to talk about, you know, the enthusiasm for moving to regional areas that we've seen during COVID, making sure that we think about that as whether it's something that actually makes sense for those regional areas, and if so, what needs to be done in regional areas to make sure that that's a positive experience for the people who are already there, as well as those who are moving in. And lastly, I guess, just again, tying into the broader theme of the need for good planning and how these processes play out, there's clearly a need to make sure that strategic planning takes place that tries to prevent growth from undermining the amenity benefits. We see those amenity factors as a real drawcard of regional areas, and it's very much a possibility that if regional growth continues, that those amenity benefits will diminish, and then the whole logic of why people are moving to regional areas starts to look a bit more questionable. We've seen that, you know, the challenges of providing additional services, the challenges of providing good economic opportunities are probably going to persist to some extent for regional areas. And so if you also lose that amenity factor and that quality of life element, then the whole equation starts to look quite different.
Great, thanks, Laura.
And just to note a couple of things that are happening, we're looking forward to seeing what comes out of the census with the new internal migration data, which I think is due in October. So that will give us a big picture about whether this regional shift that we've all sort of been assuming has happened during COVID is really played out to the extent we think it has. And just to flag, there's some ongoing research in City Futures looking at related issues around regional migration and the policy responses that are best suited to manage that. I'll leave it there.
Thanks. Sorry for interrupting.
All good.
We have a question already from Max. Max, did you want to ask the question to Laura? Oh, you just need to unmute yourself.
Yeah. Okay. Well, the question is that it's more to do with housing. I know you didn't look at housing per se in detail, but I was wondering, when the people, those enthusiastic movers, when they got to where they were going, did they find the quality or the style of housing that they wanted, and either in rental or did any of them build to stay there?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, we did speak to folks who were still there, so they had obviously found something that was relatively suitable. A number of them rented first, and then once they decided, so tapping back into Leo's question, once they decided this was really going to work for them as a regional move, then they looked to buy. We had a couple who had built and were quite happy to have the opportunity to do that and felt they wouldn't have been able to do that in a capital city. I think the other thing that was really interesting in the conversations we had about housing were people saying that they felt that one of the things that was increasingly being pushed was that there needed to be more diversity of housing and more smaller housing and maybe apartments and things in regional areas. And amongst our participants, there was a little bit of pushback against that because they said, you know, the spacious housing, the big family home, that was very much the thing that attracted us, and that was the thing we couldn't have in the cities. So they said, we don't really understand why people would want to move from a capital city to live in an apartment in Mildura or in Whyalla. That sort of defeats the purpose. But having said that, when we spoke to policymakers, they said, you know, that may be the perception, but in practice, whenever they were approving and getting smaller housing built, it was selling extremely well and there was a lot of demand. So it may again be that it's filling that role as a sort of a transitional housing space, and then once you decided you are going to settle and you want to stay a bit longer, you look around and try to see if you can access some of that larger housing. But yeah, there was a real sense that they were seeing increasingly small subdivisions, and that was antithetical to the whole point of living in a regional centre. So I think how policymakers navigate that is a tricky one.
Thanks. It just came to me because some years ago I was involved in a study looking at housing in small country towns, and one of the problems was, either if you were renting, is that the quality of what was available for the sort of people who were looking, for example, teachers, doctors, nurses, and so on, it was terrible and scarce. And so in terms of building, if the houses were being built, there were problems in just getting the trades, because there's only one plumber and he's in the next town and so on. Anyhow, that's where my question arose, is that when you get there, is what you want really there?
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly, one of the responses to that we've seen, we had spoke to some folks associated with a hospital in Mildura, and they'd said that they regularly have problem because they have a steady flow of new nurses and doctors and people coming through town, and they couldn't get them housing, and so they'd built some housing. The hospital had built housing to cater to that. But it was clearly a real challenge for institutions that were trying to attract people to be able to guarantee them that they'd get good housing.
As you said, Mildura, well, Robinvale was one of the places I looked at, and they'd done the same thing, but they with a whole lot of other, even the supermarket people, Manchester supermarket. But anyhow, thanks for that. Yeah.
Sure. Thanks for the question.
I'm going to sneak in with a question.
Sure.
As chair, I'm interested because you said that you spoke with policymakers too. I'm interested if you can reflect on what some of those policymakers said about the practicality of providing services and facilities first, which is what the residents were calling for. How does that work in practice? How could that work in practice?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think in general, you speak to folks in regional, local government in regional areas, and they feel like they're pretty resource. This resources are scarce, and so the capacity to do that. And in general, policymakers sort of reflected a lot on the fact that as relatively small operations that need to, upscale and respond to sort of much faster growth than they had seen in the past was putting real pressure on their, on the number of people they had to do the work and the opportunities. I think in terms of the bigger infrastructure, the local policymakers that we spoke to are really looking to state and federal governments to be doing the heavy lifting on providing that. I think there was some sense that there were opportunities there to, this was an opportunity for people in regional areas to get the attention of state and federal policymakers in a way that they maybe hadn't in the past, because suddenly there was this interest in regional Australia and the opportunities it presented. So they were enthusiastic about that, but I think they were also realistic about the fact that, that those sorts of negotiations take a long time, and they're in a difficult position because they don't have the resources to provide the infrastructure themselves, but inevitably it's the local government reps who people come to when they feel like things are not working the way that they should or haven't been planned properly.
Yeah, really, really interesting. Other questions?
I have a question, Laura.
Sure.
Did you look at the sort of country of birth or ancestry of people that are moving to these regional locations and their year of arrival? The reason I ask is international literature in America and Canada shows that generally recently arrived immigrants tend to concentrate in the capital cities, whereas second, third generation immigrants tend to be more open to subsequent migration out of capital cities and into regional locations.
Yeah, look, we didn't do that sort of analysis for this project, but it's, it's just echoing a bit. But I think that's part of the analysis that's been done for the third project that's part of this broader research agenda. And from, they were working with 2016 census data, so obviously we're all kind of waiting. We feel like a lot may have changed in the last 5 years, but from what we've seen, I don't think that there's a clear sort of shift in that pattern. It's still very much a real challenge that there's, policymakers think, oh, it's great, we'll get migrants to move to regional areas, but in practice it's very difficult to do. And then occasionally you get these sort of examples of, locations where they get a little bit of a critical mass of a particular people from a particular country or a particular cultural group, and then that is enough to attract more people to that area because they feel like they have that sense of community. But getting the ball rolling on that is pretty tricky, and getting people to stay long enough to get that sort of embedded community is not easy.
Yes, I suspect that's related to the visa grant by stream. So the humanitarian stream has been used to sort of relocate refugee migrants, say, for example, Afghani migrants in Adelaide. So that's sort of a federal government immigration policy sort of structure enforcing the location of immigrants. But our immigration policy has been so focused on attracting skilled migrants who tend to be, from Asian countries, aged 40 years or below. And generally the profile of those international immigrants tend to, be focused or concentrated in the capital cities where the, as we know, the education and job prospects are concentrated so far. So there needs to be a connection between federal government immigration and employment policy and local and state government policies.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd say I think the cities that that we looked at that were seeing some real affordability pressures start to come to play, Wollongong in particular, but also Cairns. There was real concern about policymakers and sort of people in the social services sector about the fact that those places have been playing a really valuable role in, as resettlement locations for refugees, and that now that was getting increasingly difficult to manage because they couldn't afford to get housing, that having trouble accessing housing that was anywhere near where they, the job opportunities were. So starting to really see that model come under pressure in some of the bigger regional centres as well.
We have another question from Mickey, a really interesting one, and we might make this the last one. It's to both of our presenters. Did climate come up as a reason for moving to regional centres? Mickey said, I moved to New England last year and a friend said there's a growing number of climate change movers here, which I was surprised by, but have since met a couple mostly older and in relation to heat?
Yeah, it's a great question. I have to say, it didn't come up as much as we had anticipated. And it more broadly, I guess, the sort of, we given the timing, we went into it thinking we might get a lot of, discussion about COVID and a lot of discussion about the bushfires and the implications of that for regional areas as well. And really, over the course of the period we're doing it, COVID just came to dominate the discussion. So it may partly have been a reflection of the timing of when we were doing the research. But yeah, it certainly the sort of the access to natural environments, that was very much an attraction, but things like the climate more broadly and concerns around heat and climate change didn't come through particularly strongly in our project. Vish may have a different response.
Yeah, we did ask a question around, whether bushfires, incidents of drought, floods, and pandemics, etc., are an important consideration. And about more than half of the population indicated that, yes, that is an important consideration. Whether that necessarily translates into how people move is a harder question to answer. But it's a consideration, yeah.
Brilliant. Well, that brings us to 5 o'clock exactly. So thank you very much to our speakers for very engaging and also very on time presentations, allowing for some great conversation. So please join me in thanking our speakers, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next seminar in a couple of weeks. Thanks, Vish. Thanks, Laura.
Thanks for the opportunity. It's been fun.
Thanks. Bye, all.
Thanks,
See you later.
everyone.